to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me as ever is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and today joining us is Hilary Potter. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
So today we're going to be discussing the German TV series Babylon Berlin. Now, Hilary, what's your background as a historian that led you to Babylon Berlin?
Well, I'm sort of a memory scholar, a studies scholar primarily, and I came across this series actually not immediately through my research, but through my teaching. I was teaching on the MA translation in Leeds a few years ago, and we were coming up to literary translation, and I thought, I like crime fiction. I want my students to be translating a bit of crime fiction. So I was in a bookshop in Germany, and I was asking for something that hadn't at that point been translated. And they gave me, they gave me the second in the series of Babylon Berlin of Volker Kutscher's novels. And it was from there that I really got into the series. And then I was having a chat with my brother-in-law, and he won't thank me for sharing, but hey, because he quite likes his sort of historical fiction and things, and he was telling me that Babylon Berlin was going to be on the TV. So in true kind of brother-sister-in-law fashion, I was like, well, Phil, do you want some spoilers? I'm on book 4. And this sort of rapidly turned into a conversation about what was actually in the series. And I'm going, oh, hang on, this is quite a lot different. So then I started investigating, looking into it more. As luck would have it, a call for papers came round for a conference called Watching the Transnational Detectives. And I put in a proposal based on Babylon Berlin, drawing out some of these differences between the novels and the films. And looking at the way the narratives have been shaped. And lo and behold, I got accepted. And it's all sort of rolled from there. And that's sort of where my interest sort of comes in, because I'm a sort of German studies scholar, previously did a lot of work on memory around a protest in 1943 and looking at its sort of post-unification representations. And so this is kind of moving back in time a little bit, but again, similar sort of thing, in that I'm looking at the different ways this sort of era has been represented, how it's intersecting in our culture, feeding into media discourses as well, and just absolutely thoroughly enjoying watching the series.
For those people who have possibly not watched it, what is the premise of the show, Babylon Berlin?
So this is a crime series set in the late Weimar Republic, so starting in 1929. And our lead character, Gerion Rath, is a murder detective, originally from Cologne. He's been transferred to Berlin. Depending on whether you read the novel or you watch the series, there's different reasons. And he then sets about solving the various crimes of the day, along with who becomes his assistant, Charlotte Ritter, who's the main female lead. And they sort of get entangled in all these complex crimes. There's a whole kind of level of moral complexity going on, sort of lots of shady characters, quite a lot of sex as well. This is it's a transnational production, but it's a German TV series. It's got everything. It's got hedonism, it's got politics, it's got crime, lots of it in various different guises. You've got poverty, you've got social unrest, and what in particular we get in the TV series is lots of flashbacks to the First World War, and there's a whole theme that's running through. I've just binged watched series 3, and it's continuing there, and I think it's going to run throughout. The First World War does feature in the novels as well, but in a slightly different way. But in the TV series, it really is sort of everywhere. I was going to count actually how many times we get flashback scenes, but I ran out of time to do the full-on geeky statistical stuff there. But you constantly images of trenches, you've got shells exploding, you've got traumatised soldiers, you've got veterans, you've got people with missing limbs, missing eyes, all characters throughout. So the First World War, if you like, is present throughout the entire series, very visually so.
When were the original novels published?
So the original novels started, the first one on which series 1 and 2 is based, was first published in German in 2007. And I'm eagerly awaiting November, because that's when book 8 comes out. And they really just sort of hit the German market, first of all, and anyone sort of, German speaking who was interested in them. And it was only once Sky had acquired the rights to this film series, that this kicks off the translation angle to it. So Babylon Berlin is published by Sandstone Press, and from what I've read, the editors sort of thought this looks like a really good series, commissioned the first translation, hoping it would pan out, and obviously it did. And now there's a whole kind of team of translators that go behind it. I mean, as I say, there's 7 published novels in German. The 8th is due out, and I think I was doing a bit of a check yesterday. The first 5 have now been translated. So the translations are rapidly catching up.
It does make me wonder if at some point he'll switch, if he can write, if he's fluent enough in English, to switch to English just to speed up his sales on the English.
He might possibly. I don't know what his level of fluency is in English. Actually, he studied history, philosophy, and I can't remember what the other one is.
Murder,
but not English anyway.
So my other question about dates was, you were saying that Series 3 carries on with the flashbacks. To what extent does time move forward in the series?
It's only been a sort of matter of months. So the first series opens in early 1929. The third series is all in the build-up to the Wall Street crash. So it's in those few weeks before, and actually it starts on the day of the Wall Street crash and then flashes back. So we're not talking massive sort of time differences between the two.
How many books has the TV series covered? Is it like one book for one series, or
the first 2 TV series cover the first book? So you get to the end of series 1 and you think, hang on, this crime has not been solved. What's going on? But series 2 just is a continuation of that. So you have one novel for the 2 series. I don't know whether feedback was not particularly good from a viewer perspective, keeps you waiting, but series 3 is based entirely on novel 2. So I'm presuming from now on they'll be kind of produced as coherent narratives of their own, different story, with the story arcs running through them, the running sort of threads that go through the novels.
Now, obviously, the books are written from a German perspective, not expecting necessarily to travel until Sky gets hold of it. As you said, it becomes sort of transnational. It's funny because I watched it and I wondered if there was sort of some American at Sky just seeing it as being an extension of some Raymond Chandler-esque noir transferred to Germany in that sort of Weimar period. I wonder how much that has changed the perspective of the books.
Certainly think the transnational aspect has been the sort of reason for certain changes, and I'll come to those. I think the books sort of have a life of their own, I think because they were very well established before Sky acquired the rights, that they're a series in their own right. And to change some of the things in the novels now really wouldn't work to make it completely align with the TV series. And I know when I was doing quite a lot of research of reader comments and things for the paper I gave last year, readers were sort of saying, basically, so long as you see them as 2 different things, and don't try and compare, actually you can get a lot out of them all. I mean, when I get the novel, that's it. I'm sat there and I'm glued, and I love it. And I do still sort of see certain things in the series and I keep thinking, oh, that's different, or oh, actually I think that's been adapted from book 4 or whatever, as running bits of stories that are filtering in from the novels, but I don't think it works quite the same the other way round.
Sounds very much like the Game of Thrones defence.
Possibly.
Particularly from some of the latter seasons, if you just can't compare the TV show and the book anymore because they just haven't translated across as well. Yeah,
I think so, and I think sort of a lot of the visual kind of imagery and a lot of the tying into the First World War theme, or perhaps we could call it the amplifying of it, is a lot to do with what's that general interest now. So when they were first sort of producing Babylon Berlin, we were still in the midst of that 4-year centenary of the First World War, so there's lots of images that are quite dominant in the sort of like the public imaginary, if you like, in the media. It's quite a sort of prominent theme. Obviously now we're in the sort of like centenary of the Weimar Republic. We're in the Roaring Twenties, so there's a lot of kind of images that they're building on. Would it be useful at this point to kind of just give you a very brief summary of the novels? Then we can tease out some of the differences. So the novels themselves. So Gerion Rath is our main male lead. He's a detective, slightly in the sort of crime fiction vein. He's a slightly very single-minded character. Doesn't always do things by the book. Bit of a lone wolf in his way. He is basically transferred to Berlin from Cologne, which is his native stomping ground, because he accidentally shot a suspect. They're in a hot pursuit. He shoots the suspect, who then dies, but the suspect is quite well connected. The media effectively hound him out of Cologne. Handily for him, his dad is the chief of police in Cologne, gets him a position in Berlin, in the vice squad, not in the murder squad, which is his natural sort of professional home. And only Gerion's immediate boss knows why he's really there. It's all sort of hushed up. Gerion is traumatised by his experience of the shooting soldier and being hounded by the media. So he has all these sort of flashbacks, and he develops a bit of a drug addiction, which gets him involved accidentally in the Berlin mafia scene. So he's then being manipulated by one of the Berlin mafia rings, and is trying to do his job. So he's this morally dubious character, not necessarily of his own making, but he's put in that position, and it's like he's a little pawn in the game. Enter sort of stage left, if you like, Charlotte Ritter, or Charlie as she sort of is more commonly known. She is the typist in the police service. She's quite an independent character. She's studying the law. She wants to go into a career in the law or in the police, and she's using her sort of work to fund her studies. It's a story familiar to us all. But she's quite a feisty character. She's very independent. She's very politically aware, much more than sort of Gerion is. And inevitably, there's a love triangle or love story that runs through it. There's this on-off relationship between the two of them. And I won't give you too many spoilers, but that's how you say. So you've got these quite sort of diverse sort of characters, and she also acts a bit like his moral conscience quite a lot of the time. Now, when we get to the series, she's been quite transformed from this sort of feisty, independent character to a sort of down at heel, clever but poorly educated woman who comes from this big, poor family. She's getting piecemeal work, working in the typing pool at the police station, supplements her income as a prostitute in the nightclubs of Berlin, with a particular speciality in sadomasochistic prostitution. So it's quite a leap from her novel version. And also she's open to blackmail and corruption, because if you read Say Selder's work on sort of Weimar crime, prostitutes had to be registered with the police in order to trade their wares. But Charlotte obviously doesn't want to be registered with the police because she wants a career in the police, and that would definitely stop it. So she's an illegal prostitute, if you like, which means then when Gerion's corrupt boss finds out that this is what she's doing, he basically uses her services and blackmails her into providing information on Gerion, so that he can sort of stop him from discovering all the corruption that's going on in the series. So, as I say, quite a shift. Gerion in the TV series is this shell-shocked former First World War soldier stroke prisoner of war who is building up his career as a police detective in the shadow of what they assume initially is the death of his brother in the First World War. His older brother was the Golden Boy, and Gerion sort of very much lives in his shadow. And he is initially transferred to Berlin, not because of anything that happened in Cologne, but to solve one particular crime. And the idea is that he will always go back to Cologne. At the end of Series 1, he decides to stay in Berlin. We see this story of his trauma through flashbacks to his First World War experience on the Western Front, and being taken prisoner. And that's sort of the kind of key differences, if you like, between the two main characters' novel versions and TV versions.
So is Gerion a First World War veteran in the books, or is this an invention of the television program?
This is an adaptation. So in the novels, he does his basic training, and then the war ends. So he never serves on the Western Front or on any front. Interestingly, in the novels, there are 3 brothers. There is Anno, who is the middle brother, I think, who dies in the First World War. This is his backstory. And then there's the oldest brother, Severin, who has objected to the war from the beginning and emigrated to America. So he becomes the black sheep of the family to everyone but Geryon, who remains in contact with him. Severin does not appear in the TV series at all, and I can't see a way to sort of integrate him in at this point, which is maybe something we can tease out later. The prisoner of war story is also a complete invention for the TV series, and has this running thread going through where, as I say, his brother Anno in the TV series has supposedly been killed, but just to ruin it, any anticipation for you here, sorry, that Anno isn't actually dead. So Geryon and his family have long believed that Anno is, somewhere on the Western Front, body never found. Turns out he survived, massively disfigured. He takes on a whole new identity. And then there is this psychologist figure who is somehow also linked to the Berlin underworld. And it turns out that Dr. Anno Schmidt is actually Anno Rath, Geryon's brother. And throughout the series, he's having sort of counselling sessions with Dr. Anno Schmidt, who then is teasing everything out of him, but not just about the experiences in the First World War, where they were fighting together, and Geryon thinks, he abandoned his brother to his death because they were in a shell hole together when Geryon is taken prisoner. But also there's this whole backstory with Anno's wife Helga, who Geryon loves, and there's a whole romantic twist going on between them all. And so this is Anno's way of getting his brother to confess. And of course, by now Helga is on the scene in Berlin, and there's a relationship going on, and Geryon is bringing up his nephew effectively. So there's lots and lots of twists and turns going on that have been, they're fantastic. They're not in the novel, but they are fantastic. Like, see how it's teasing it out. So the First World War is also used as a device for kind of, brothers confronting one another, fighting over a woman.
I love the fact that he's created this entire new identity with a new kind of job and a new aspect to his character. Not going to bother changing his first name, though. That seems like an awful lot of effort.
I know, it's like, that's just too much, that one detail, why be picky?
How would I know if someone was calling me in the street?
Exactly, I don't want to give myself away.
How much do you think the TV series then sort of plays into a set of stereotypes for the international audience to be able to sort of lever us and drop parachuters sort of almost into that world? So there is quite a lot of box ticking of traumatised soldiers, amputees. Comradeship is a big one throughout. Seemingly, I've only put the first series. It slots in all over the place. This first of all, comradeship between men. Yeah,
I think there's an awful lot of that has been sort of the stereotypes, the cliches. They're all in there, and interestingly, in the novels, Volker Kutscher kind of plays on these stereotypes and sort of subverts them, sort of like, so Severin, for example, is used as a sort of way of critiquing kind of, that masculine culture and, it's German and manly to fight for your country. And, there's stereotypes about women in the novels that, Charlotte, they call her a prostitute, even though she's not. He uses it to subvert it, whereas in the TV series, they wholeheartedly absorb them. There's your amputees, there's your soldier figures, there's the sort of the military hierarchy all there, all those images. And if you come to the sort of the thing about women as well, there's a lot of the prejudices and stereotypes of the age. There's the neue Frau, the new woman, who is sort of depicted as that, with the roaring 20s, with the hats, the shorter skirts, the shorter hair, the woman who's sort of independent financially, goes out to work, is embracing sort of the new life. And in Weimar, the Weimar Republic, this was seen as very much a kind of, if you like, an attack on sort of fragile male masculinity after the First World War. Women are very much, in the workforce, present, and they have to get the country going again. They're still working, but they're they're seen as a sort of attack on masculinity, if you like. I think, was it Barbara Hayes calls it a psychic projection of fragile male masculinity following the First World War. And I know Ingrid Sharp talks about them being seen as dangerous women because these women are independent, so they're not seen as kind of, you know, doing their job in producing children and rebuilding the nation through their typical kind of womanly role pre-World War One. So they're sort of mocked as, you know, sexually deviant if they're having sex outside of marriage. They're sort of seen as being kind of very sterile, very masculine, and we get that in the characters. So if we think about Charlotte, she's seen as being deviant because she's very sexually aware. She's very sexually liberal with her prostitution as well. And she's seen as being kind of complicit and criminal because she is completely open to blackmail for Geryon. Then there's the character Svetlana Sorokina, or Countess Sorokina, who is sort of embroiled in this gold smuggling plot that runs throughout series 1 and 2. She is embroiled in a whole gold smuggling plot that is the kind of the central crime caper that's going on. She is very much sort of stylized as a very androgynous figure, very masculine looking. She, you know, has her lover who she double crosses for the purposes of her crime. She dobs him into the Soviet embassy to try and get him killed off, and has their fellow revolutionaries bumped off as well. She cross-dresses, so she's the singer in the Mocha FD nightclub. She appears as a man. This is her alter ego. This is how she lives between two different worlds. And all these images tie into some of the even scientific studies of the day. So I say that with inverted commas that you can't see. But there's a study by Eric Wolfen, I think his name was, a sociologist, that basically sort of said, you know, these women, the new women, they sort of were a scourge on society. They created, or they facilitated, criminality. So these sexually liberated women, basically, even if they didn't commit crimes themselves, they made men commit crimes. So they were responsible as well. So there's an awful lot of blaming the woman that goes on in the Weimar Republic, and so yeah, very much is playing into those stereotypes.
Can I just go back to just before? I'm fascinated by the stuff about the New Woman, because there's a British equivalent, but it's actually a pre-war. The New Woman's a pre-war, late 19th century figure. But I was interested by your remark about the appearance of the physically disabled in the television series. You know, amputees and other sorts of physical disability, which is actually quite, you know, in the British tradition or the Anglophone tradition, is quite unusual. And I'm wondering how the transnational element of the television series plays into the decision to choose to visualize war damage in that way, as opposed to focusing on the psychologically traumatized veteran, which is so prevalent in Anglophone representations of the war.
I wonder, I mean, I don't know for sure, but I wonder whether it's a lot of it is to sort of explain or pitch Geryon's backstory, because as well as sort of seeing these flashbacks that he's traumatized by, he also has sort of seizures, like epileptic type seizures that are brought on by stress, and the stress is then linked to to his experiences in the First World War. And his boss, Bruno Volta, uses this pejorative term called Zittermänner, which means like quaking men, shivering men. So it's this sort of to convey this idea of contempt for the soldier in society, or the veteran in society, because all those veterans, be they physically disabled, or whether they've got a sort of a psychological condition, whether they've got any kind of ailment that reminds them of the war, it's sort of a physical marker of shame. So I think they're sort of using those figures to really create that atmosphere, building towards sort of nationalism, that they want to reject this idea of being a failure, and all those figures represent Germany's failure in the First World War. To sort of build up those sort of story angles, I think is possibly why they've done it. I should say, Volker Kutsch in his book, I think it's book number 5, the March Fallen, I wrote them down. He also plays on this quite a bit in the story that runs throughout the crime series. That the novel opens with the death of this street beggar, this sort of horribly disfigured man who is clearly a veteran of the First World War, and it's initially kind of dismissed as, oh, he's just a tramp. Anyone could have killed him. But it turns out he was one of this sort of band of German soldiers who, during the end of the First World War, had sort of got a load of looted, and they'd hidden all this money or gold. I can't quite remember what it was now, but there's a whole crime plot linking all these former soldiers, and one by one, all those members in the group are being bumped off. I don't know. There's a theme that's kind of building throughout, of sort of linking the First World War with crime, showing a building sort of tension around how the First World War plays out into the psychology of the Weimar Republic, it being unlike the Anglophone sphere, where it's associated with victory. It's associated with shame, and all the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, if you like, link back to this idea of, this is about our defeat. So democracy in itself is a product of defeating the First World War, of shame, doesn't sit well with national pride. So it's sort of rejecting everything around that.
I think it's quite an interesting distinction, because you do see a sort of prettifying of the war in Anglophone representations. We've talked about body horror in the war previously on this podcast, but actually, in my experience of television adaptations, at any rate, is that physical disability doesn't appear, and you get many, many, many psychologically disabled or disturbed veterans, and that is the mark of their war trauma. There's nothing about the physical trauma that men suffered. And I think it's really interesting that might be a reflection of the war experienced as victory. The way in which the soldier is then constructed as victim is in some ways more complicated, so it's simplified down to, well, the only trauma they can suffer is invisible. And it doesn't even include, sensory deprivation. I'm still waiting for the deaf veteran.
Yeah, so far there's not a deaf veteran. There's various blind or partially sighted veterans in the novels, and I won't. There's a spoiler. I won't spoil Series 6 because it's so gruesome. It's brilliant. But I'm thinking as well there might be sort of a link with the Weimar traditions or Weimar cultural outputs as well, because I think Babylon Berlin, I've termed it a palimpsestic production because it's about Weimar, it's about the First World War. It's even a little bit about sort of fin de siècle, early 20th century culture coming in there. And I think what we don't see sort of visibly, but I think is there, is a sort of post-45, certainly a post-unification framing of sort of ideas around memory debates that filter into Babylon Berlin. But visually it's set everything before certainly the first series is everything before the end of 1920, 1929. But sort of with the physically impaired veterans, I'm thinking of Fritz Lang's M, and it's the blind beggar who ultimately identifies the murderer. So there's a sort of continual theme of these sort of the injured veterans turned sort of homeless person throughout sort of German cultural productions of the era, as well as this. And there's quite a few sort of other sort of cultural references that I'm seeing. In fact, there's another one in Series 3 that links to M, where the plot in M, the first victim we see, the first child we see murdered, was called Elsa. And then in Series 3, we've got the murder of the second female victim, and the headline in the press when they come into the police briefing in the morning is, the second Elsa's been killed. So there's geeky little cultural references in there going, oh, if only I'd seen this in time when I was telling my students about this film. But anyway, so lots and lots of things. And I think there's also a bit of a reference to Arthur Schnitzler's Die Traumnovelle, which I think, is it Dream Rhapsody in English, where there's a whole masked scene, which is in Babylon Berlin, is to do with the occult. But it very visually, it parallels what happens in the novella and in Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, only in this time the women are actually clothed in Babylon Berlin. but visually it looks very much the same. I'm thinking, I was teaching this only several months ago. I'm seeing more parallels.
I was wondering the stereotyping, especially of things like the war. Whose stereotypes are we saying? Is there a German stereotype of the war that they're following, or are they following a Western stereotype? Because the two things that popped to mind were, from a British perspective, when he surrenders, he doesn't, of course, surrender to the British. He actually surrenders to the French. Now, if that was a British production, the French should have just been written out of it. But at the same time, you've got that, you have that part where they all get together and the combat is the unifying factor, and they all express this idea that the army was never defeated in the field. And I wasn't sure if that's is that a German stereotype of the war veteran, or is that a Allied Western sort of victory stereotype?
I think there's an awful lot of trying to universalise this image so that the soldier, whatever, is seen as sort of a victim, sort of a pawn, if you like, in a game played by others, so that there's no real difference between Guerillon and, say, a British soldier, an American soldier, or a French soldier. There's a certain amount of sympathy that will transfer across national boundaries. The kind of the gathering of the veterans, I think, is really, really interesting, largely because it's such a mismatch sort of with the sort of historiography, with what we know around prisoners of war in particular. But if we go back a little bit to the sort of war ideology with the German army, that it was this idea of that you fight to win or you die in the process. If you surrender, then you're a traitor if you're taken prisoner of war. Even if you're incapacitated when you're taken prisoner of war, you're seen as being a traitor. So there's this whole sort of psychological torment that particularly prisoners of war went through during the war when they were in captivity. It's what Brian Feltman calls the stigma of surrender. They were sort of conflicted, felt they should be able to go back and fight, that they weren't serving the fatherland. And then once war ends, they're worried about how they're going to be treated when they're repatriated. Post the First World War, so post the armistice, the Allies refused to repatriate German prisoners of war for a long time, partly to use them basically as the bargaining chips of the day to ensure that Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. So prisoners of war weren't repatriated until the beginning of September 1919 is roughly when they started. So they became this sort of cause célèbre, if you like, in Germany. Germany's in turmoil at this point, but they're then seen as victims. So prisoners of war are repatriated sort of 1919 and into 1920, and they're initially received very much as sort of like returning sort of heroes, victims. There's a whole series of memoirs that are published. So one of those, Jessica, you'll be familiar with the Skipton POW diary, which is fantastically rich, because there's a really good picture of life, certainly as a POW in Britain, different to in France. And so for a couple of years, these sort of memoirs run, and then they're sort of lost from the sort of the publishing landscape, if you like. It's no longer a topic until you'll get the rise of the Nazis, where they then vilify the POWs as the traitors, as sort of, having failed the fatherland. Now, we know as well, sort of through historiography, that a lot of former POWs ended up joining the ranks of the Nazis to ultimately prove themselves, to prove their masculinity, to prove their Germanness. So what I think is really curious in Babylon Berlin is that scene, I can't remember which episode it is in, where they've got the old comrades together, and actually it turns out that these are part of the Black Reichswehr, this sort of band of veterans who are basically going to try and overthrow the state. And they sort of take Guerillon under their wing, and he's recounting his traumatic experiences, his guilt at having kind of frozen on the battlefield, his brother's calling for him, he's been injured, he's calling for him, he can't help him, and then he's taken prisoner, and that's the last he sees of his brother. And there's almost this kind of paternal, understanding, kind of slap you on the back, don't you worry, my son, sort of type attitude, really, really understanding, which is a complete mismatch with what we would think of the sort of the Black Reichswehr, the army. It really just doesn't fit together, and I think that's a really curious sort of mismatch, if you like, between the two. And I think it's very much there to make you empathise with Guerillon's story. It just spectacularly just doesn't fit with historiography.
Are they both in the? Oh no, it's because they're both in the film and the book. They're not in the book because he's not. He doesn't serve in the book, does he?
He doesn't serve. I mean, the story about the Black Raikeswood is in the novels, but slightly differently. But he doesn't serve in the novels. He just does basic training.
Oh, go on, Jessica.
I was just going to ask Hilary quickly if she wanted to explain a little bit more about the Skipton project and how the sort of knowledge created out of that sheds light on the series.
Yes, certainly. So Skipton is a town in North Yorkshire that had a First World War prisoner of war camp. Originally, it was an army training camp known for, I think, most famously for the Bradford Pals did their basic training up in Skipton. Early 1918, the camp was repurposed as a prisoner of war camp. I have to say, the British weren't spectacularly good at taking prisoners in the First World War to start off with. As the end of the war got better, they got better at it and soldiers were surrendering. So then there's kind of a limit on capacity in the camps, and more camps are sort of hastily put together. In Skipton, originally it was just an officers' camp. Eventually it had soldiers of all ranks in there. And they had a relative degree of latitude when we think about prisoners of war now, and if we think about Second World War prisoners of war, there are much stricter regulations. But in the First World War, so officers were treated as officers. They weren't permitted to be used, certainly not in Britain, as labourers. They had to be sort of paid their equivalent rank. They had to be treated by their equivalent rank in the UK or the British Army. And this actually has a lot to do with the legacy of the Boer War, that Britain was, in its approach to prisoners of war, was concerned about some of the backlash it had in the First World War, the Boer War, and tried to then make sure that they behaved as honourably as they could, relatively speaking, in treating prisoners of war in the First World War. Now, and amongst the things that prisoners of war in the UK were allowed to do, or certainly allowed in Skipton, was they were allowed to go out on long walks, for example. They signed like a gentleman's agreement that they wouldn't flee, and duly they were allowed to go walking out in the dales. But one of the things that was forbidden was the writing of any kind of memoir. So they did this in secret. Around about 50, if I remember rightly, 50 men were involved. They all wrote on different aspects of life in the camp. So it's not a chronological sort of account, but it takes on different aspects of life in the camp, from everything from charting their arrival, talking about the Spanish flu pandemic, talking about theology, feelings about the war, their mixed feelings, when there's the ceasefire, down to things like food in the camp and all the kind of the comedy japes that kind of went on amongst the troops, including kind of allegedly serving Bolshevik soup in late 1917. And then once they were repatriated, the men basically, with stereotypical German ingenuity, sewed bits of the manuscript into their uniforms. So if they were searched on departure, the manuscript wasn't found. It was then compiled by Fritz Sachser and Willy Kossmann, two of the officers in the camp, and published in Munich in 1920. This, as I understand it, as the story goes, they sent a copy to the library in Skipton that at some point made its way into the attic at the Skipton Library in a shoebox, in a 1960s shoebox, where it lay undiscovered for decades until I believe Alison Fell was doing some research there. It was given to her, handed over to the German team in Leeds, to Caroline Summers and to Anne Buckley, who set about translating this diary, which, if everything's going to schedule, I think it is due out in October this year. So this Skipton diary has given us a whole sort of insight into the way German prisoners of war, what they were thinking, what they feared, what their life was like, which gives you a very rich picture of what it was like to be a German POW. Certainly in Britain, obviously the case in France was different. They weren't treated as, I say well, it's all comparative. So you have this understanding of the trauma, the psychological perspective that the Skipton project has sort of given me. That then when we're looking at the prisoner of war narrative that runs through Babylon Berlin, it just doesn't fit, particularly not with that once you've returned to civilian life and we've moved on in time from the war. This sort of particularly how the POW is seen by veterans and the military hierarchy in particular. Because in the scene in Babylon Berlin where they're all together, you've got the upper echelons of the remaining military there. They were the drivers of this ideology of, you fight to the death or you're a traitor. And yet they're kind of going, oh, you poor lamb, you've really suffered. We really empathise with you. And at the same time, they're these gung-ho men who are planning a coup that fails, but they're trying to basically remilitarise Germany and get the Kaiser back.
With regard to kind of the earlier conversation about Western versus German stereotypes of the First World War. So you gave us a little bit of reading, which I really, really enjoyed. And I was talking about the show to a friend of mine in Germany called Rabia, who got very excited that we were going to talk about Babylon Berlin. So she's amongst our thousands of listeners. So she'll enjoy this. But one of the questions that you raised in your writing, which I thought was quite interesting, was what version of the Weimar Republic are we looking at, and does it depend on where it is in the world that you're watching it? Because the show is the show, but you make the point that certainly in Britain, the view of the Weimar Republic is as effectively a failed state that's an immediate precursor to the rise of the Nazis, therefore discounting 10 years of history. And the idea that it was always going to be a failed state, you could see it on the way in and straight the way through. But does that view of the Weimar Republic exist within the show? Is that something that British audiences are going to project on it? Are German audiences going to project something else about the Weimar Republic on the show?
I think there's actually quite a bit of similarity between the sort of like this idea in Germany and in the UK, between this idea of the Weimar as like an inevitable failed state, the kind of the sandwich spread in between the First World War and the rise of the Nazis, if we want to go with the sandwich analogy there. I don't know why I'm thinking of sandwiches. I've had lunch. But anyway, but one of the things actually that directors sort of flagged was they wanted to draw more attention to the Weimar Republic, because even in Germany it's sort of given less attention and everything seems to be refracted through the Nazis. So it's about sort of also generating an awareness about the Weimar Republic in and of itself, rather than it just being framed as this sort of interlude between the two that was always going to fail. I mean, if you look at some of the historiography, there's arguments say actually no, it wasn't doomed to fail. It sowed the seeds of its own downfall in its very liberal constitution, but it wasn't by any means a foregone conclusion that would happen. But it did.
Are elements of the characters' characterization, for want of a better word, also intrinsically kind of critiques of Weimar, in the idea of kind of respectability, but also debauchery, or masculinity versus disability and vulnerability, or fluid gender roles? Are the characters embodying critiques of Weimar? I
don't see it in the TV series. I mean, maybe I'm not looking close enough. I see it very much in the novels. In that, particularly with like Charlotte, who's the female lead in the novels, and them playing on these stereotypes of her, and Kutscher as the author, he plays on those as a critique, and likewise he plays on this idea of the honourable soldier, because he looks at and sort of national pride by using the character Severin as the black sheep of the Rath family, because he refused to fight. So I think the critiquing definitely happens in the novels. I'm not so sure it really happens in the TV series. I think it's like, let's have these stereotypes. There's sort of allusions as well to cabaret in there. Let's get these figures that will appeal. They will make us think of certain things that we already know about Weimar, but not necessarily critiquing them.
Certainly, from a look, it's an interesting look. They've sort of they've picked when it's sort of somewhere between sort of Fitz Lang and some strange 50s-esque detective fiction. I can't believe how much these people all smoke.
Cigarettes everywhere. Well, that's the legacy of the war as well, because
it is indeed.
Men were sent cigarettes, so a lot of them started smoking in service.
So, where are we closing on now? Where do we want to go next?
Should we talk maybe about some of the other references, sort of cultural references that are in there? a little bit. I think there's a big thing about, when I was talking about fin de siècle as well, I'm thinking of Freud and psychoanalysis, sort of, using psychological techniques to help overcome war trauma, and it kind of with the sort of story between Gerion and Dr. Arno Schmidt, aka your brother. There's a lot. The sort of structure follows very much what Freud and also Josef Breuer did in their early kind of work initially on hypnosis as a technique, and then that developed into psychoanalysis. So you see all those things about, you have to trace your symptom back to its first occasion, and you can remove the physical symptoms by recalling the forgotten trauma, and that sort of trauma, all those symptoms become at their greatest once they're being talked through. So you see in the flashback scenes across the series, Gerion gets further and further into his backstory and becomes all the more agitated and sort of physically unwell, starts having more fits and so on. And then actually in series 3, this has been resolved, or we think it's been resolved. All his physical symptoms have disappeared because we think he's resolved his backstory. Unfortunately, sorry, spoiler again, by the end of series 3, the shaking is back.
Is there any sort of reference to the more disciplinary methods of dealing with psychological trauma that were definitely part of the German military medical system during the war?
It's much more Freudian. Dr. Arno Schmidt is billed as this big sort of character. He's on the radio as well, as being, this is the new way to deal with it. This is the new way. So it kind of excludes those harsher methods.
That sounds typical. We've all become Freudians now.
Well, he's poo-pooed, isn't he, by the crowd in the lecture theatre when one of them suggests that electrocution is a much more effective way, and they all sort of walk out at him.
Yes, there is that. Actually, I'd forgotten that.
Yeah, season 1. And he's sort of left with his cigarettes, quietly smoking as they all leave.
How often in reviews is I can't remember the main character, the detective who's getting psychologically treated. Yeah. His name, Gerion. How often in kind of reviews and kind of work around this series is he described as suffering from PTSD rather than shell shock? Partly I ask to see how vexed Jessica needs to be, but also in a kind of a wider sense of a mishmash of competing terms.
Actually, now you mention it, it's not really a feature, certainly not in the UK press's reception of it. They very much pitch it as this kind of, lead up to the Nazis sort of thing, and poor Germans, we can now finally see them as victims, which is a bit of one of my bugbears. But yeah, PTSD, shell shock doesn't really, neither term really appears. It's set more on the kind of the crime and the sex and the Roaring Twenties, and some stereotypes you often find in sort of British reviews of German films or novels. You've got your references to your sausages, lack of humour, and Nazis, of course. The good fallback.
So Gerion doesn't have psychological trauma in the backstory in the novels.
Not to do with the war. He has this sort of recurring nightmare about shooting the suspect, and that's causing his sort of departure from Cologne to Berlin.
I had a sort of translation question, which is on, Jay Winter's argument that shell shock is the untranslatable term, that, even shock traumatique, as it's referred to in French, doesn't capture what shell shock captures in English. And I'm just wondering what sort of language is used in German to describe that sort of psychological trauma.
Yeah, they don't. I'm just trying to think what the German word is. I should have looked this up before. I can't think what shell shock is in German. They don't refer to it directly as an official term in Babylon Berlin. Not that I can think of, but they talk about this idea of the Zittermänner, the Quaking Men. And it's meant as a very pejorative term. It's not meant with any sort of empathy, any understanding. It's seen as being a failure of being manly and probably a failure of being German, but it's largely not then referred to. And in the novels, it doesn't appear, but his trauma he kind of deals with by dabbling in a bit of cocaine, and talks to Charlie as their relationship evolves.
It's some sort of morphine type drug that he takes to stop his shakes, isn't it, in the TV series?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
He regularly sits there knocking back,
having an injection of the morphine, which the Berlin mafia tried to spike as a means of killing him, because he, in a sort of intoxicated state, bumps off. There was a mafia man sent to kill him, but in this sort of completely spaced out state, he manages to kill the man who was sent to bump him off, and buries him in a building site, dumps him in concrete, which happens in the novel as well, and therefore then he's the sort of the mafia's sort of little pawn, if you like, inside man in the police.
The most unlikely mafia man. The most unlikely priest, who's enormous and covered in tattoos.
Yeah, he looks like such a comforting soul, doesn't he? You could feel you could open up to him.
Also, did he manage to bury this guy in cement whilst also high on morphine? Because his constitution must be formidable.
It must be. He has a formidable constitution in Series 3 as well. Comes back from the near dead.
Is the cocaine / morphine / whatever he's on, is that a Sherlock Holmes reference?
I don't know, actually. Could possibly be.
Because it would seem like a logical trajectory. And you've got the transnational referencing, and again, across cultures.
But unlike Holmes takes it through boredom, though, he takes it for stimulation. They don't. It's more of he can't function without it, isn't it? It's more of an addiction. So you've slightly got a different reasons behind it.
But isn't Holmes... I mean, yes, Holmes uses it against boredom, but isn't that because boredom is trauma for him? He uses it to anaesthetise himself against the fact that he cannot stand to not be active.
And Watson spends an awful lot of time saying, you are addicted to this. The way to break your addiction is when you get the mental stimulation of a case. Yeah,
possibly. That's another angle for me to think of as I'm redrafting my paper. Thank you very much.
Well, do you think we should perhaps leave Babylon Berlin to rest until we've got some more series to analyse that have all come out?
Yeah, absolutely. I did want to put in one more thing actually about Series 3, because it occurred to me, and it links back to World War One, and I'm kind of intrigued to see how this is going to develop, because those I haven't mentioned so far are the war widows, which are obviously prominent throughout the series. Gerion Rath's initial landlady, Frau Benker, is a war widow. Her husband served with Bruno Volta, Gerion's corrupt boss. So they're dotted in the landscape throughout the series as it is. And initially she kind of comes across as this very kind of austere character. You're assuming she's probably something of a German nationalist. Series 3, she seems to be transforming into this character who's sort of, a plucky kind of character, supporting or going very much against the sort of the right-wing turn that the Nazis are becoming more prominent, or certainly the far right is becoming more prominent in Series 3, and she hides her Jewish tenant, her other tenant, from the Nazi thugs. So Kattelbach is her other tenant. He's a journalist, and he's published some military secrets to prove that they're trying to rebuild the army when it's against the Treaty of Versailles. So the Nazi thugs are after him. She hides him. She has this fantastic wardrobe that's got a back door that leads into a different part of the apartment. So she shoves him in the wardrobe, and the thugs search the flat and don't find him. And then that passes, and then the police come around eventually. Meanwhile, he's been hidden at Gerion's flat, but she's this sort of plucky character who looks like she's going to develop from the poor, quite nationalist war widow into potentially a kind of anti-Nazi figure, sort of little, not perhaps resistor, certainly opponent. We see her in Series 3 also helping to smuggle some military secrets to Kattelbach that she's acquired through the daughter of General Segers, who is a communist and very anti-military, and she's overheard what's going on, and she gives these photos of military plans to Elizabeth Benker in the series. So there's some whole espionage going on there. So I'm kind of intrigued to see how this develops, whether the war widow becomes the anti-Nazi, the unsuspecting resistor to Nazism.
I thought they planted a seed for that very early, because in the first season, is he the head of police? Very quickly, once he's introduced, he's highlighted as being a Jew. And I thought, it's interesting, because the whole Nazism's it's not quite in your face yet. And I thought, are they going to really bring this to the fore, or are they going to let it breathe and be a crime drama and almost let the politics sit in the background? And then they went, oh, but he's a Jew. He'd think, well, maybe there's some plan to bring this forward and bring it out. And I did wonder if that was possibly for a box ticking exercise for an international audience, because it's expected.
Quite possibly, because the Jewishness doesn't come up as much certainly in the early novels. So the Nazis are a bit more prominent in the series than they become. They're much more in the novels. They're much more in the background, and they're seen as like the neo-Nazi thug, or the Nazi thugs rather. And just they're dismissed. And then as you get, I think, to about book 3 or book 4, they become this more ominous movement, having much more of a role. But I certainly think you've got that signposting very early in the series, to tick that box to keep the viewer hooked, and to look, because one of the things that the directors wanted as well was they wanted it to be about Weimar, but they wanted it to resonate with today, so you can empathise with the characters, and also with that hindsight of, well, we know what's coming, so you empathise with the characters more because you're going, okay, he's Jewish, this is not going to end well. So it sounds really flippant, but yeah, I think so. There's deliberate signposting going on there. But we'll have to wait and see whether my theory pans out about Elizabeth Benker becoming this kind of anti-Nazi, the figure that won't be suspected in memory of her husband. Maybe, I don't know.
Well, ultimately, it'll be interesting to have a conversation about once it's all finished, is how far it has diverted from the books to be, as it becomes something completely different, which, as you pointed about earlier, Game of Thrones, Chris, we might never know, because we're still waiting for the final books.
Yeah, any day now, apparently.
It's keeping us on tenterhooks, that's what it's doing.
So, shall we leave things there? Chris, now, what are we talking about next time?
So, in an interesting potential comparison, next up, we're going to be talking to Emma Hanna about Peaky Blinders for a kind of a different view of interwar experience and crime, but on the kind of the gangster end of it, a kind of a British examination of post-war and kind of lawless masculinity, I suspect will be a running topic that I know that Emma is very excited about. Yeah.
So thankfully I've already done my homework. I've crammed all 5 seasons. Last 2 I didn't need to watch because they're dreadful, but the first 3 are superb.
I'm looking forward to discussing the most absurd method of curing shell shock I have ever encountered.
So yeah, we look forward to that. So if that's all for now, thanks everyone, and we'll reconvene soon.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks, Hilary. Great.
Only once we take the hand when we got plum and apple